System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Today is Sunday, November 3rd. My name is Amin TMK. I have alongside with me Emoja Lil Tanky Sumler and, the ghost in the shell. You know what it is, Keita the Muscle. Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. The last weekend before the elections, and obviously that's what today is about. Any first words before we get this thing started? I have a big list of things I'm going to ask you guys about, but any comments?
Man, I'm just always so happy for it to be over. I don't look forward to it all. Again, I'm a dude. I look forward to jury duty. I do. I'm like, I might be able to impact something today. I might be able to bring a guilty company to retribution. I might be able to keep an innocent man out of jail. I do not look forward to elections in America.
Keita, any first words?
Oh, because elections are bullshit, at least the way they operate in the United States. But we'll get into that.
Let's talk about it. I mentioned this in one of our other episodes, but I think this is going to be this is the episode I've been wanting to talk about because, we hear all this every time the elections spark up. We always are hearing, hey, this is the most important election of our lifetime. You got to go out here. You got to vote. You got to do these things because it's about choice, right? You want to go out there and say, make your voice heard. That's the whole thing that we hear in the United States. Make your voice heard. And when I look at my elections, and I talked about this a little bit briefly on one of our other broadcasts, I only have 3 presidential candidates to choose from. Mind you, one of them is out of the race in JFK, Junja. And then I don't have Jill Stein. I don't have Claudia De La Cruz. I don't have the Libertarians. I don't have Cornel West. I don't have any of these. Yeah, Claudia De La Cruz. Yeah, but the PSL, you're right. And I think we read there are 7 major parties that are not major. I guess there's only 2 major parties, but there's 7 total parties with legitimate organizations, with legitimate politicians who have legitimate policies. Then they're just sitting out here, but I can't vote for one. Not only that, when I look at, I have my notes here, because I'm getting heated already. I don't understand write-ins. If you're eligible to be written in as a candidate, why can't you just be on the ballot? It's not like you can write in anybody. It's not like if everyone tomorrow wrote in Lil Tanky on their election ballot, Emoja would not be the whatever alderman of Ward 8. He would not be because he's not in the write-in candidates. So why on earth would we have write-in candidates not on the ballot? Not only that, several, I count more than half on here, only have 2 choices, Democrat, Republican. That's not okay. We have 23 candidates in the Sri Lankan election, and that has way less people than the United States. When I also look at this, guess what we also have? Elections where one person is running. What is that's not a selection. Mind you, on my door, I got a flyer from someone in my neighborhood who's actually running. Like, hey, write me in if you don't want to see a Democrat or whatever in front. And I'm like, okay, let me write this guy's name down because this guy is an actual neighbor of mine. I don't know if y'all had an opportunity to look at your ballots or you've voted already or what your thoughts are. I know, Tanky, you're kind of against it. So I'll start with you, Keita. Did you have a chance to look at these ballots, and what are your thoughts on just the American voting process at current?
The American voting process is bullshit, and it's for the reasons that you list, which is what are my options for voting, and how restricted voting is too, because the way the supposed American democracy works, or at least the way American elections work, is that you are voting for someone to represent you in office. And then that person gets to vote on the laws and develop the policies that affect your life. That kind of representative form of democracy, although that's not the United States form of democracy, mind you, but that's the illusion of it, is representative. And I have to say, first of all, I'm always upset when I only see one candidate. That upsets me. Now, the three of us are the type of people who enjoy research. We like digging in, we like doing the work. And so I do not ever accept that there's only a binary choice. Now, I do not ever accept that there's only one legitimate choice. And a write-in system is stupid because it puts the onus on the voter rather than the government really taking its responsibility to say, hey, here are all of the options presented. Here are all of the people who followed the rules that we outlined and the laws and policies that we outlined to be on the ballot. No, it's up to each individual citizen, which is why organizing is really important, to figure out who is running in my district, my ward, my county, if you have my state, and of course on a national level. Now, my issue with this is if you are not Democratic or Republican, finding those write-in candidates felt like, I have to find an obscure 10 BC text that's in Aramaic in order to understand what do I put on this freaking ballot. I mean, to the point that even Lil Tanky was like, you know what? And I love this about him, but he's like, you know what? I'm going to email the Green Party and the Socialist Party. I'm going to email them and ask them, who are your candidates? So I understand what my options are for voting. And even that didn't get us the answers that we wanted, to the point that I'm like, okay, honestly, this sense of choice is an illusion. Anytime anybody presents you a binary, and I feel this strongly in just my life, not even elections, if anybody presents me with a binary, I have to reject it and see what other options that I have. And the American election system has reduced, eliminated, and compressed all of our options to, okay, now it's dire, y'all. It's down to the Democrats and the Republicans, who absolutely are not representing the people.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on it are first, controlled opposition, right? We're told that this one option is the worst thing ever, and there's only one solution to it, this other thing, which also might be very bad. That's delicious when you look at what controlled opposition looks like. Because on the one hand, you have to sell your opponent as the most dangerous thing in the world, right? In which case, you would think the logical suggestion would be, if this one person is the most dangerous person ever, give everybody as many choices as possible so that they never have to choose that person. Because again, they might not like you either, right? You would think that in the United States, it would be incredible. So a couple of thoughts come to mind immediately. First off, one of the things that Amin said was non-major parties. I just want to push back on that because it goes to show how vast the resources are of the Republican Party and how vast the resources are of the Democratic Party. And what I mean by that is, imagine some of these quote unquote small parties that are still on 35 ballots out of 50, right? What would we say about a small business like that? Like if I had a hamburger stand and I got a hamburger stand in 35 of the 50 American states, I would say I'm doing pretty good, right? Like I would feel like I'm winning. So how is it you can have these parties that are on 35 states ballots and we still don't think about them as a minor choice, right? We think about them as a minor choice or like a fringe choice, right? Just with the incredible amount of work it takes to even be on this amount of ballots, which goes to the next thing, the write-in ballot. There shouldn't be a write-in ballot process at all. Every ballot should have a write-in, and anybody that is a legal citizen of the United States of America should be eligible for that, assuming they meet the residency requirements. Like, if I live in Texas and I want to vote, if I want to vote in Bun B for the governor, I should be able to put in Bun B. I dead ass should be able to do that. He's a Texan. He's lived there. You know what I'm saying? And if enough people do it, the will of the people, the Romans had a system like this where sometimes certain noblemen would be impressed into the government at the will of the people, right? And again, all of this is supposed to be based off of Roman Republic stylings and Greek stylings. You know what I'm saying? These were things that really had to happen. Sometimes the people didn't trust any of the politicians and had to pick someone else to be their representative that were not necessarily from the political class. Like, these are things that happen, right? And so those are just my first two thoughts. The last thing I would say about this, and I've been on a crusade about this forever, the fact that I can go to irs.gov right now and get any information that I need about my taxes, right? They gonna know it's me. The IRS will absolutely know it is me. They're gonna have a biometrical, same thing with my bank. If I call my bank right now, customer service, they're gonna have a biometric report of my voice. They're probably gonna have a retina scan. My phone can absolutely 1000% verify it is me. So why isn't there a governmental app that every American can download where I can do my voice, my votes from my phone, right? And it all gets to my greater point is that they don't want these people that tell you democracy is the most important thing in the world do everything they can to remove choice. And so that's my hope.
Yeah, because even in some ways I agree and disagree with Tanky, because digital access to the internet and access to smartphones and apps is not universal across the American experience. And so we don't want to cut an avenue of voting off. We want to increase people's opportunities.
I'm not saying that's the only way you vote, but I'm saying everyone that wants to vote that way should be able to do so. And it would make counting and verification a breeze.
Yes. And the reliance, because in one hand, I have the luxury of being able to mail in my ballot, but there are states and municipalities in the United States where citizens do not have the option to do that. Not least of which we always have to bring up too, that there are about 1.2 million people in prison in the United States right now as well. And they don't get an opportunity to vote. And even if let's be in the reality, if you have a felony or you're in prison, you aren't allowed to vote. But people who are forced to be in jail this week, will they have the opportunity to vote? Will the sheriff or the cops give them a ballot and say, hey, you have not been convicted of a felon, you're in here temporarily because of these charges, but here is your United States citizen right to vote? And we know that doesn't happen either for people who are in lockup and have to endure that as well. And so there's this idea that, and then for me too, I don't want to vote for people. I want to vote for the things that matter to me, my community, my friends, my family. And it seems like that gets denied the American people too. You have to vote for people who you hope will vote for the things that you want. And we saw this fall apart in 2016 with where it was like, oh yeah, the electoral colleges don't got to do what the majority of the people want anyway. And that's why we have these battleground states. And that's why a lot of people too have one idea about what does this democracy mean in the United States, which we have to acknowledge it's just not here. And then what power can you gain from a system that disenfranchises you at every single opportunity? But I always go to look at the United States founding. The founding fathers that everybody sucks dick for, they didn't want you to vote either. They were very much like, yeah, the majority of people are dumb. And so we need to make sure we limit their ability to be dumb on a grand scale. And so we're going to limit voting to these people, and how that continued to get whittled away until it only represented 6% of the population. And because that was the founding of United States voting and rights, and we just tried to add on rather than say, hey, everybody gets a right to vote. Everybody, regardless of your incarceration, regardless of, I mean, honestly, to me, regardless of your citizenship status, if you live here and you contribute taxes, you should be able to vote on the things that affect you, and particularly on multiple levels, not just on a presidential national election. And then how many people are also not aware of how many elections their state or county has outside of the 4-year voting cycle. And folks are not aware of it, but then for every 4 years, the presidential election comes up, and these are the people who are the loudest in your face about, why aren't you voting? You didn't vote. Okay, well, did you vote the last time county sheriff came up? Did you vote to increase minimum wage in your state, particularly for servers and disabled people?
I just want to say another really nefarious thing that I've never really seen happen before this election, which bodes, I think, quite ominous. Especially if this is a national trend. I think, I mean, you were the one that brought me aware of it, and I've seen more of it. People are blowing up mail-in ballot boxes. They're blowing them up. So what do you do in that situation? Do you know that your vote was counted? Do you try to vote again and perhaps break the law? Like and this is another
Oh,
reason
no,
why
it's no
physical
perhaps.
artifacts.
Because you have to sign the attestation on the back of the mail-in ballot that says if you vote twice, you will be incarcerated or you have to face a $2,000 fine.
Right. So you're left with this situation where you don't even know if your artifact was counted at all. I mean, once again, right? Joseph Stalin. He who votes determines nothing. He who counts the votes determines everything.
Oh, but that's also happening with people going in physically to vote too, because I'm reading news reports as well about how, let me correct that. I'm not reading news reports about this because the news is not covering this. What I'm reading is kind of anecdotes and people's personal experiences, which may or may not be able to be verified, but something that we always have to be cautious of, particularly since I'm Black and I know that this country has denied Black people, the right to vote by putting up barriers. And those barriers include, yes, there's a physical location where you need to vote. Well, people are going to the physical location where they need to vote and they're being told, hey, there's something wrong. You can't vote here. And then they walk away. But there's no way to verify, like, wait, I can vote here. Is this my correct voting location? Which a lot of people have to contend with, particularly in rural areas. And then how do you have that opportunity again? Because it's not like they have an option to do mail-in ballot. They have to go physically somewhere to turn in their vote. And then those are also getting burned and attacked and vandalized. And so it puts this entire election up anxiety to 100 for a lot of folks who, do I face the fine and risk incarceration because I tried to vote twice, but nobody could help me verify whether my vote was counted? Even for me, I had to register to vote 4 times because it kept not showing up saying like, hey, you haven't registered to vote. Well, I've done it. And for me, I spaced it out over the course of weeks just to make sure, verify that I had it in. And then finally it registered. And it's like 2 weeks before the election. Like, people are in this weird place where they don't know. But as Tanky and Amin point out, we have to see this as by design, that it wants to put the election up in flux, and it wants to give a whole bunch of people doubts and anxiety about their choices. And then, but that puts into doubt about the structure of the United States as it is, because we have no assurances with our food, with our voting, with who represents us, with where our taxes go. Like, what agency do we have as United States citizens?
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to say again, right? This is one of the things that's really tough about electoral cycles. Like with us, we work in geopolitics. Like, not only can I tell you what the politics are of the Biden administration, I can talk to you about the politics of like Xi Jinping's administration. I can tell you how Macron's government changes from like what a Le Pen's government. Like, this is literally what we do. But when you're dealing with Americans, you're dealing with low information voters, right? And so like the Dunning-Kruger beat off the chain. Like, so we're at a point now where it's such a cult of personality cycle of administration that runs. You really don't know anything about any of these politicians. I can't have a politician and be like, yo, what's your vision for the USDA? Right? Like, what kind of people do you want to have put in there? Do you feel like people that are the administrators of the USDA should be coming from backgrounds where they were working with these farms or the corporations associated with American farming? Like, we don't get to know what their views or values are on these kind of things. What do you look like? What does a Homeland Security administration under you look like, right? And take it away from the vapid talk of like, we're going to build a wall, right? But like, really, like, what is your FEMA plan? What is your planning look like for like a potential something like a COVID, right? Like, what is your pandemic plan? Like, these are the kind of things that really matter. Not like, oh my God, Kid Rock endorsed Trump. Oh my God, Hulk Hogan is with Trump. Oh my God, Cardi B and Beyonce. It's like, this is really vapid. It's incredibly vapid. And that's by design?
By design, because humans are incredibly social creatures. We put our, and that particularly in the United States, there's this parasocial relationship that people form with celebrities, thinking that they're your family in many ways, even though you have no idea who that person is. So, but if you have the perception like, oh, I trust this person, I love this person, I care about this person, and then that person endorses a Trump or Kamala Harris, then it's like, oh, well, I can trust them because like that's representative of who I am. And also why people are honestly so vitriolic and rage induced when someone says, I'm not voting for your candidate, because they've made it their entire identity in a way that's like, first, not healthy. Like, you really got to examine the parasocial relationship of that and why this person is all tied up into your personal identity as a human being. But that it's difficult to have conversations about United States elections, about United States policy, because the reality is the machine is moving, and it is moving towards an inevitability of human decline and human extinction is what it's moving towards. And to not acknowledge that, because when I said like what agency do the United States people have, it was rhetorical, because we do have a lot of agency in, of course, continuing the protests, in learning about other protests that happen across the globe, and in learning how to, like, what steps does it take for revolutionary organizing. That's the responsibility of United States citizens when we see that this country has hurtled straight into fascism, but also have to recognize its founding was always there, because the British colonized the native indigenous lands of the United States.
You tapped into something else that's also really interesting, right? The American experiment, the American cultural society is based on this concept of politeness, right? It's not niceness, it's not kindness, even, but it is politeness. And the election cycle just destroys any veneer of that, right? Any veneer. You have people that talk about harm reduction and safe spaces all year long in your DMs, threatening you and talking wild. Like, all of that veneer of politeness is, you must not know who I am. I mean, and it's everywhere. It's all across America in such a ridiculous, vitriolic way, because again, like you said, these candidates become projections of the voters' egos, right? Their most sublime version of self. So, like, if you're a Trump voter, you see this masculine man, this Archie Bunker that made good, that's going to make America good again. It's gonna stop all of the woke, right? If you're voting for the Kamala, you see the girl boss, and it's time that America had a strong woman. And yeah, she got some flaws, but who doesn't? And she's way less flawed than Trump. And like, in all of this is like none of their actual governance, right? Like, but it's just this projection of your own values, and you'll fight for that because it becomes a reflection of you. Again, that's the brilliance of the Democratic and the Republican project.
There was two things before I get on to sort of my second part of this conversation. Number one, I think it's important to acknowledge like ranked choice voting is something that is very prevalent throughout the rest of the world, and that's something that's we're trying to get here in the United States. The ranked choice voting, Ohio is dealing with this. I know Washington D.C. is dealing with this, and I think if most people even understood what ranked choice voting was, I can't imagine how anyone would vote against it, but it is going to be interesting to see where that happens. Number two, we hear this all the time from our Democrat fans or our political people who say, go vote, go vote, go vote, because they always say things like local elections. It's not just the presidential election, it's the local election. But if I still have the same choices in my local election, which is two, and let's be real, if you're in Washington, D.C., unless you live in Cleveland Park or Tenleytown, you're probably not a Republican. This is a very Democratic district, even though it's not a state, which is another complicated situation because Washington, D.C. doesn't have senatorial or whatever they call it representation. So again, it just goes to show that there's a breakdown of democracy. Not everybody is involved and not everyone is counted. The last thing is you hear a lot of this from the Democrats, and I hear a lot about this when it comes to the Voting Rights. Oh, Voting Rights Act. Back then, we had to pay $2 to vote. Black people had to pay $2 to vote. Back then, this and that. But the fact of the matter is, voting suppression is still a thing. Most people still don't vote. 45% of the eligible public in the United States does not vote. And I wanted to just touch on that in comparison to the election process in Russia or the election process in India, where the election process is weeks. Many of those times people don't have to work. There are several elections that have to go through. There are several candidates that fall off and runoff elections and all these other things. And we hear about these countries and we think to ourselves, well, these are developing nations or BRICS nations or Russia's bad, but yet they still have these very long elections. And now, look, I get that early voting is a thing, even though, let's be honest, many Americans bitch about it, and they look at it as another way that invalidates the democratic process here in the United States. You mentioned it, Tanky, with the exploded ballot box during that's early voting. That's what I'll probably do when I have my ballot. I'll throw it in the little early voting section, which I love and I do appreciate, but not all states have. Not all states are uniform. And this is a democracy. How can we not be uniform in the way that we count our ballots? Not to mention the electoral politics and senatorial votes, and not every vote equals 1v1. That's probably for another podcast. But I wanted to ask you, Tanky, specifically, we hear about all these elections and election fraud everywhere we go. I believe there was just an election in Georgia. We talked about the Sri Lanka election that had over 23 candidates. Why does America look like this democracy when we have this one day to vote and all these other countries have sometimes several weeks?
Because you want to make the results more predictable. I mean, that's the reality of it, right? What America has shown over and over again throughout the length of its empire is if there's anything they're actually really not great at, it's controlling elections, right? I mean, so you end up with these situations that are very, they're not what you expected. Right. We had this in Vietnam where the Americans thought that they could control the election and their person would win. And the North Vietnamese candidates were always more popular with the people. Right. You had this in I think Iraq is a great example after the Americans conquered Iraq. Right. After the Second Gulf War. They had no expectation that all of these Shia Arabs that had never voted really, that had been suppressed under Saddam's Sunni Muslims, they came into power. The Americans had no understanding of this. I think Iran is another great example. Mossadegh, right? This was a guy they never wanted to get elected. That was totally elected. Much more close to home for you, Gaza. Right? In the 2000s, when they had the last elections, they were not expecting Hamas to win those elections, and they destroyed Fatah people who were controlled by the Americans, right? This is exactly why right now you do not see an election in Ukraine at all, because the Americans know they cannot control the opposition. Right? That's going to be somebody else. You have to bring him under your purview, hope that he does everything that you say you want him to do. Right? And they thought they had this in Georgia. They thought because they had the president, right, who, by the way, wasn't even a Georgian citizen until 2004. Right? This was a French person. They were the ambassador to Georgia. They become a citizen of Georgia, and now that person is the president of Georgia. They've been trying to pass this legislation to essentially since the Ukrainian war's lost, right? So they want to find other ways to hurt Russia. They thought they could do that with Georgia, right? They thought that they could bring Georgia closer to the EU. They lost that referendum. And immediately what happens, right? The EU puppet president is like, it must be Russian interference. We don't have any proof, but there must, right? And so these things happen.
Sound like Hillary Clinton.
Sounds like Hillary Clinton. Sounds like Donald Trump, right? They're meant, whenever they don't win, we have to cast shade on the election. I mean, once again, and we had this once again in Moldova, where Republicans like to talk about mail-in ballots. Moldova only passed this threshold of like 51% of wanting to join or tighten their relationship with the EU, and this is only with all of these expats that are living all throughout the European Union mailing in ballots. It's like, do you live in France? Like, why are you vote? You live in France. Why are you voting for a Moldovan referendum, right? You've already chosen the EU because the numbers on the ground, once again, demonstrated without those voters, the Moldova would have absolutely rejected closening ties with the EU. EU's a toxic property right now. And all throughout Europe, everybody that can get out of the EU, they're trying that. I mean, again, you can look at Viktor Orban, how he's with Hungary. He's trying to continue to have closer ties to Russia because he wants to save his economy, right? There's this thing, but there you go, right? And then Venezuela, just once again, when they lose, you cheated. And I think this is what Lula is afraid of. I think this is why Lula has become recalcitrant and is becoming much closer to the American empire. I think he's afraid of what might happen in his own election.
We talk about a lot, like we joke with about the Jordanian king, and he's not the only monarch here, and we laugh and
he's terrified they might bring some democracy.
Exactly, and not to mention, and that's one of the reasons why Assad is also like looked at as this dictator, but it's like, okay, he's trying to cling to power. I totally get that. So is every other politician. So is and I mean, at least elections happen, again and again, and it just goes back to this idea, like the democracy was supposed to be here, right? So we didn't have kings and queens and nobles running it. I mean, this is why so many revolutions began, and it seems now like, I mean, especially when you look at someone like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and I guess this question will be for you, Keita, is like, we have like this idea of democracy is like we're able to vote for the little guy or able to vote for this, but it does seem like Donnie J, just a straight up white supremacist elite, and then Kamala Harris, who just seems to be like the exact person that this society wants, which is someone that will say yes. And it seems to be just hurting the United States in general. We always hear the corruption is why we win. I mean, is this some of the reasons that these elections are just useless and people are tapping out?
They're useless for a range of reasons, because sure, we can tout Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, that they were put in positions of power. But even in the United States, we talk about political families a lot, and unironically at that. So we're like, oh yeah, we're not one of those monarchies like the Brits, or we don't have kings and queens. Yes, you do though. You have ruling elite political families who have been in power for hundreds of years. I even think about this when it was a jokey, I think it was the New York Times, maybe the New Yorker, the Washington Post did this jokey, like ancestry.com, who's connected to who's the cousin of Dick Cheney. And you find out these people that you thought were entirely separated, who even position themselves and propagandize themselves as, I'm not part of the system, I'm somebody new and fresh. And you're a distant cousin of the ruling political families that have been in political power for what we're coming up on is 100 years or plus that, right? And how even that is by design. The United States hasn't even, honestly, the United States owes reparations to the entire globe, but it definitely owes reparations to the Native Indigenous peoples that is still trying to commit genocide against, and the Black people who were enslaved here. And the fact that you never got right on that, you stole Native Indigenous lands. And then we're like, well, if there's not enough people for you to vote, and even like Native Indigenous peoples as a political entity, how they're the only folks who have to do blood quantum and prove that you have enough Native American blood. Now, for anybody who is aware of how biology and genetics works, blood is blood at the end of the day. For you to put eugenicist arguments on Native Indigenous people so that they can't build a large enough political body within the constraints of the United States election system, because why can't anybody here, we can apply for sanctuary if we desperately needed to in another country, and yet I can't apply to say, hey, you know what, I actually really appreciate what the Navajo are doing in my community, and I want to be part of that electoral body, I want to be part of that political system. We can't do that. Even the Black Panther Party has been diminished to such a degree by everything that the United States has done, and that anybody supposedly new or fresh was not, that we find out that they were a lie. Even AOC, how it was like, oh yeah, just this Latina from the Bronx, look at her, she was a server, she understands your needs. And then here she is going to the Met Gala in her performative ass dress, being like, oh, but I'm still one of the people. Even Bush, because in the 90s, even before I was even thinking about like, what does voting mean in the United States, and hearing white military men talk about, oh, he's one of me, he is a millionaire, how is he one of you? I mean, his daddy was in the military. And even before that, because we always look at a presidential election on a broad scale too, because it's one of the most prominent positions. But as Tanky points out, there are positions in the government that United States citizens have no idea what they do, who they are, but also how they can stop the entire function of government and put up a bottleneck for it. And those positions are held by the Bushes, the Clintons, people related to Obama, people related to Kamala Harris and her husband, that they're all keyed in and have taken over the entire government. And so then when we see that they've taken over the entire government, and also, you know, we have to talk about geopolitics, as Tanky put out, because this is what Israel has done. They've infiltrated a whole bunch of political agendas and governments where you find out, oh, you're an Israeli citizen, then how can you legally be allowed to hold a position of office in the United States or in Britain or in France? And yet you do. And somehow I'm supposed to believe that you're not committing treason right now. But that aside, that they've been in these positions of power as Secretary of State or in the Department of Education somewhere, making their way up the political ladder, that a lot of people do start now at the city council level and then try to work their way up to, well, I want to hold political office, I want to be state senate, or I want to hold a national office. What does it take to get there? And the machine moves to help them get there and prevent anybody from coming in. So when we talk about the constraints of write-in ballots, yeah, because who has access to the American political system? When you need what they're saying, Kamala Harris got $1.3 billion in fundraising. How can any other smaller political party match that? And the federal government won't give them money to succeed.
And when we talk about like the control of the machine behind these candidates, right? So again, one of the things that I've seen the most apt comparison between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is Donald Trump represents the will of the oligarchs. This is why people like, like Elon Musk are behind him, whereas Kamala represents the will of the corporatist. And they're not the same. They move differently. But like the fact that these people are so detached from their own decision making, this is why they're not able to have those conversations because it hasn't been decided yet. And they're not necessarily the ones that will decide them. What I mean by that is like, you couldn't go to an American presidential candidate and be like, what is your Department of State going to look like? What does that look like to you? What type of an agenda would you like to move, right? What does your foreign policy look like as it relates to these? Because they don't get to make those decisions. Ostensibly, you think that they do, but they really don't. The corporations that have then financed them, or the oligarchs that have put up those billions of dollars for them to become president, with that comes a little list of suggestions. I mean, it's just like in House of Cards. These are the 5 people that you will consider for Secretary of State. These are some ideas I have on who should be over at the Department of Defense. Like, these presidents aren't even making these kind of decisions, right? And that again, it goes to Americans do not understand the machinery that is at work behind these kind of things. Like, Blackwater is not giving you all this money because they think you're brilliant. They're giving you this money so that you will execute the world as they wish to see it done. You are literally, a president is literally the stand in for executive power to execute the will of their financiers. That is the truth of American politics.
This is my last thing. I wanted to talk about this because it's kind of not new news for us, I guess, but like, I mean, it is new news for us, but this conversation is a little bit older. Now, we remember the French elections, which I am not here to tell you about. I honestly don't understand. I mean, as much as I be and moan about the electoral politics here in the United States, I really don't know what goes on with prime ministers and how those things came to be and you form governments. But the French elections occurred. And the broad, okay, leftist coalition won. Now, they don't have a prime minister or seats or anything like that. Again, I'm not trying to, say the validity of this because, they are getting power only merely because they won. They won. So yesterday, the PSL movement, Claudia de la Cruz, the Claudia and Karina ticket, as well as the Cornel West Abdullah ticket, basically put out a statement saying, if you are in one of these states, which I can't even be written in as, mind you, Tanky already talked about this. We can't even write in Claudia de la Cruz. We can't even write in Cornel West if we wanted to because they're not official write-in candidates. So they put out a statement saying, if you're in these states, vote for Cornel West because we can't, we personally can't be written in. And in these states, Cornel West asks if you are in these states, vote for Claudia de la Cruz and Claudia and Karina ticket. About 2 hours after that, PSL also released a statement in, I guess, solidarity with the Green Party saying, hey, if you're in any of these states, please vote for the Green Party because they represent us closer. And in these states where the Green Party is not available, vote for the PSL movement. And I guess all three of those have sort of been working together. I guess my question for y'all is, what are your thoughts on that? And it always seems as if the left always has to do this heavy lifting of creating these parties and things like that. So I'll start with you, Tanky, and Muscle, you can go after.
I mean, it just goes to show that the leftist movement in the United States is connecting more than it really ever has, and they're moving past egos. And I just want to compare and contrast that with other namesake parties like the European Greens, who sent the letter, to Jill Stein saying you should drop out. Like, these are guys in Europe that you hear Green Party and you hear Green Party. And it's like, oh, they're the same. But it's actually like the American Green Party has more in common with the PSL party than the Europeans. Like, the European Green Party is a party that allowed the Nord Stream to be blown up, which is the single largest environmental disaster of the last decade. And they're still running as environmentalists. I mean, it's just detached from reality.
Yeah, what about you, Muscle?
All in agreement with what Tinky said. It's it's why is the onus always on the left? And then I think also it limits imagination, right? It's showing what's happening on the other side, because on one hand, the fact that someone's question to me is, well, what else can be done? Any number of things. I believe so strongly in the human imagination. We've made up so much shit to our detriment. Why is it always easy to make up shit that hurts us, but not make up shit that helps the majority of people, that helps as many people as we can help, not even necessarily the majority? And in many ways, too, it's also working within the constraints of the system, because now and this isn't a specific United States problem, but what countries across the globe are now grappling with, particularly after what Israel has done and how it's shown itself on a global scale too, is that we have to have systems that are flexible and can change. But it's not anybody singular, I think, as in a lot of cases too. And that's why many people put their identity into voting, because you're hoping like there's one candidate out there. There's somebody, there's one thing that I can do and then be done with it. But like, that's the American ego. There is not ever one thing. Like, this is endless, tiring work, but it's worth it, because there's no reason that billions of people across the globe can't make this place livable and exciting and joyous for all the other billions of people who live across the globe.
Yeah, all well said. I want to just kind of give y'all like the last word, anything that we missed, like any statement that you wanted to make. We have the elections coming up on Tuesday. So when our audience sees this, it'll be the day before the election. Any just, I don't want to say like plea you have to the people or thoughts, just finally before we slide out of here.
Win or lose, act like you've been there. Most of you guys, unfortunately, are still going to vote for one of the two primary candidates. One of you guys are going to lose. And the thing is, for everyone else, what we know on the left is we never expect our candidates to win. So we're always continuing to do the work. Like our off season, people will have a 1-year on season and a 3-year off season. You know what I'm saying? Your off season got to be much, much smaller. If you're really trying to make the world into what you want to see, you have to have a very small off season, and you need to be mostly manifesting that yourself through your praxis, through your actions, and through building community. That's what you got to do. Voting is not building community. It's actually one of the easiest, simplest things you can do, and it's often not that easy. But as it comes to the work, it's definitely one of the easiest, simplest things you can do, and you're not done.
Plus, I'm going to respond to Tanky and then I'm going to finish. Plus, the thing about voting is it wasn't available to huge swaths of people. And what did you think that they did in order to assert their rights and their right to exist in many ways? It wasn't through the vote, considering it was denied to so many people. And so like, we really do have to kind of go back to what do those organization and community roots look like. My final closing thoughts is, elections is too big a topic to fully capture in a 45-minute podcast. I'm going to just acknowledge that right now. There's so much in just United States history. And then we try to cover French elections, Iran, like Russian elections, there's Indian elections. There's such a broad range of how different countries approach this. And so some of the books and research that really kind of inform my thinking is, of course, people need to research types of government, which is different from types of economies, because people think like democracy and capitalism always go hand in hand, and they do not. They're two different concepts. Civil Rights Act of 1960, particularly for anybody in the States, the Voting Rights Act, you need to read that shit. Read original text. That you should also read The Many Varieties of Voter Suppression by Brittany Gibson, One Man, One Vote, Decades of Court Decisions, because court decisions is also why the United States voting system works the way it does. And some of those court decisions also meant who is allowed to vote by determining who is white enough to vote. And so by that reason, you should also read The Color of Law. You should also read the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 and read Black codes, which were voter suppression laws all throughout the South that determined how Black people could or could not vote. And you'll see exactly how it's being re-emulated for the modern day politics today. Because in many ways, fascism is not original. Okay, the steps that it takes are always the same. And so you can see these same concepts, these same voter suppression laws appear again and again across the globe with different names and different faces. But once you notice those patterns, then you'll stop putting yourself in with celebrities and political families. They're not your identity. You're going to notice too, how do you act? What are your policies? What are you saying and not saying in a way that I can trust? And then become a better voting citizen.
This is the last thing I want to say before we get out of here, because I do feel like for me it is a plea. Um, I've been just talking to a lot of friends, or people have been hitting me up and just finding really difficult discussing with their friends and family that they are no longer going to be voting for one of the binary political parties. Of course that saddens me, but I mean, it just goes to show like how big a bully everyone is every 3.5 years to kind of push you into this vote that you have. And it takes a lot of strength and power and bravery to not only do the voting thing, which you can just silently do, of course, but living your life every day in the way that you vote and make, when people are around you and they You kind of have to tiptoe around them. That's not really an existence we can do if we're trying to make real things happen. That includes your family, your partners, the people that are closest to you. And if we do care about the G side in Palestine, if we do care about indigenous land back, and we care about, protecting Black people, and we care about, protecting the queer community. If we really care about these things, we have to not bully our family when it comes to them saying that we're going to vote for third parties. And America is bursting at the seams. Every moment you spend blaming people who are trying to further, the human rights in this country, every time you push back with the what about Trumps and things like that, you are diminishing people's desire and ability to create a better world. And those people I can't forgive. Like you voting for Kamala, you do whichever you do for your votes. But when you bullying people to move away from third parties, in a lot of ways, you're my enemy. And I view you in the same way I would view a Trumper with a MAGA hat kind of vibe. I want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners. We're available everywhere you find podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. I want to give a shout out to our patrons because, they be putting their money where their mouth is. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate them. Tom LeBeau, Turn Leftist, Dubsy22, Nicole Hedges, Jay Gillard 94, No Ground, RK Paul, Alyssa, Lauren Dennis. You can also be a part of our Patreon, patreon.com/InnerCityLeft. You see all the description there. We also have free subscriptions if you just want to say hey, because we're just trying to connect and vibe. I know I asked y'all for final thoughts, but I guess like littler, smaller final thoughts, I guess, before we out of here.
Just hold each other with grace and patience. And hold yourself with grace and patience, but don't think like you're an isolated event. We need other people, and we need other people now more than ever.
Don't say nothing in nobody's inboxes that you wouldn't say to their face. Remember, it's a real world. Some of us ain't liberals. Some of us is tankies.
For Key to the Muscle, Emoja Lil Tanky Sumler, I am Amin TMK. This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Peace.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.